There seems to be a darkness around this country. I would dare say this darkness is now prevalent around the entire world. You see, this darkness is in our homes, it's in our schools, it's on our roads, it's in our minds, it's in the everyday things that we do. This darkness is in our churches, it visits our synagogues, it's in our streets. This darkness is taking away the joy that we have as individuals, as people on this earth. And that's why Diverse Talking Heads podcast was created. I'm Calvin Gibbs. I'm the host of Diverse Talking Heads, and our podcast was created so that we could continue the conversations that need to be taken, conversations about these things that are prevalent in our society and how it affects us from a diverse point of view. Diverse Talking Heads was first formed as a thought during the summer of 2020 when there was a lot of racial strife, there was a lot of grief. We were in the middle of the pandemic. People wasn't sure. There was a lot of fear. And it seemed that that darkness that I spoke of earlier was just prevalent in everything that was said and done. Diverse Talking Heads is a podcast that I moderate, and the panel is made up of people from different walks of life, different races, different religious beliefs, different jobs or ideologies, different sexual orientations. And we come together and discuss things like raising the debt ceiling, the opioid uh, epidemic, the Delta variant, and how it uh, caused mask mandates, and should schools be virtual or in person. You see, Diverse Talking Heads also talks about hate. We talked about hate crimes towards Asians and Jews. We talked about racism and Karenism and Kenism as well. But then there was foster children in the pandemic and how they were being treated and thought of during the time when the world was topsy turvy. The defenseless foster children who needed a home to bring them in and to love them and to give them what they needed also in this time of uncertainty. You see, Diverse Talking Heads, I'm proud of the work that this podcast has done because we speak openly. I believe that we all speak from a position of being a participant in this thing called humanity. We try to see things from other points of view. And I know that myself as the moderator, oh man, I've grown a lot because I have to research topics that I may not be familiar with. And as the podcast goes on, I learn some things from the panelists' point of view. I learn questions that can spur conversation. And then I have learned how to lead that conversation. And sometimes the conversation leads us down a rabbit hole. And it's my job as moderator to decide if we're going to go down into that rabbit hole and follow that line of discussion or whether I'm going to bring us back to the topic at hand. One of the topics that we've had on the podcast was during our first season. We had a discussion about diversity during the holidays. And I think it was very eye opening, uh, not only for myself, but for the panelists. And I hope that all the listeners got something out of that as well, because diversity during the holidays is something that a lot of people don't realize is a thing or should be a thing. We're so focused on us and how we celebrate that we don't recognize a lot of times that other races, other uh, people have celebrations going on during the holiday time that we're oblivious to. Corporate welfare is another topic that we covered. And oh, another good one that we did was a diverse look at Valentine's Day. The title of that was You Forgot What? Yes, Valentine's Day and how people celebrate it. Uh, it's very interesting from different races, different religions, different sexual orientations, different mindsets. Something like love, something that should be as general as breathing, often takes shapes in several shapes, forms, and fashions as to how we acknowledge that day or just love in general. We talked about why we can't separate justice and sustainability in the food system, which made us think about the economy, how there are areas in this country, in the world, where people don't have access to good food, water in some cases. And then there are other cases where people waste food, they waste water, and how we can get justice and sustainability for all people. You see, diverse talking heads is not meant to solve the world's problem. It's not meant to solve this country's problems. It's meant to give us something to think about, something to discuss, and then something to follow up with future discussions. Not only us in the podcast, me as moderator and the panelists, but for the listeners to take it to their jobs, to their homes, to their social circles, social media, and continue this conversation. I believe that there is a darkness that is slowly enveloping the world. Through this podcast, we take out our flashlights, if you will, and we shine light where there's darkness because we know that where there is light, there can be no darkness. And while the light is on the darkness, we can see what the darkness is doing, what the darkness really is. And then we turn the flashlight off and we move to another area and flash darkness in that area because there's darkness everywhere. And we realize we can't solve the world's problems with our little flashlight. But if everybody starts turning on their flashlights and having these discussions, not only in our social circle, but all across the country, all across the world, then we can start to shine some light on that darkness and it would cease to exist. There can be no darkness where there is light. So remember that. We also have talked about some tragedies as far as topics, the schools and the mass shootings that go on there, security and safety, but not only in the schools, but mass shootings across the country. It's getting to the point where children are afraid to go outside and play. Children are afraid to go outside and play. And parents are becoming afraid to let their kids go outside and play, supervised or unsupervised, because of this concern over mass shootings. And people have this thing about shooting guns. And then there's the assault rifles that are illegal in so many states in the USA and around the world, and the damage that they can cause. And why does a military style assault rifle have to be used or in a home setting? Or why are people in home settings allowed to have these types of weapons? We talked about the overturning of Roe versus Wade and what that means for the country, what that means for the people that were in favor of overturning that landmine decision by the Supreme Court. And that brought us into the November 22 midterm elections, and we could not let that go by without talking about the elections. Who was running? Red versus blue, conservatives versus liberals, Democrats versus Republicans. It was a very engaging conversation, and we all know that talk about politics should be a discussion that's had among people. That's why we have so much argument going on, because people don't discuss. They don't listen to other points of views. You know, they have theirs, and they feel everybody's that's against their point of view is wrong. Period. But once we start listening and seeing the other side and getting the full story, that's important. Then we can start making better decisions. During this season of Diverse Talking Heads, of course, we talked about scams. So many scams out there, door-to-door scams, telephone scams, internet scams. Scams are everywhere, scams against the elderly. And the title of that episode was Scams. Can You Get Got? Oh, we found out that anyone can get got. The US is having problem with immigrations getting settled in America. And we talked about that from the point of view of the Ukrainians coming in and getting settled in America, and how America was so open to them. And I'm sure we're going to cover going forward the Mexican immigrants, Hispanic immigrants coming into America, crossing the border, and them being shipped from Florida and other places like Texas to sanctuary cities, if you will, like Chicago, New York, and how the resources are being stretched to the maximum. Is it right? Is it wrong? Topics for discussion. So I hope that you have enjoyed learning a little bit about Diverse Talking Heads. One of the topics we're going to revisit in the upcoming third season, which will begin in September 2023, is we will continue to talk on critical race theory, CRT. What are the people that are against CRT? What are they so afraid of? What are they really afraid of? Is there anything to be afraid of? History is history. Everybody's history is everybody's history. You don't want to take part of history and try to hide it, act like it didn't exist, act like the players that were a major part of it didn't do anything. So we're going to really dig deep into critical race theory. Another thing that is on the radar is the cell of melatonin, and how that is so valuable in this country. Did you know that just a gram of it costs $500 or better? And where does it come from? Black people, African people. Yeah, the ones that's being killed in the streets are valuable resources and minerals being taken from those dead bodies. We'll talk more about that in the upcoming season. Also, we're going to talk more about, of course, federal police reform. Federal police reform. How can the federal government step in to make sure that police are doing their jobs in such a way that it helps the neighborhoods they have committed to take care of, to keep safe? And what should be done with rogue police that endanger the communities, that endanger specific classes of people? How should they be dealt with? That and many more topics will be handled during our third season of Diverse Talking Heads. And I invite you to tune in. I invite you to check us out. We're hosted by Spreaker, Spreaker.com, and you can leave messages on our Facebook page, Diverse Talking Heads Podcast. We have a YouTube page, Twitter. We're on most accessible podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Anchor, and Tumblr. So we hope that you would check us out on Diverse Talking Heads Podcast. Again, I am the host of Diverse Talking Heads Podcast. And I do want to say a special shout out to our panelists. We have a group of panelists that have uh, really dedicated themselves to being a part of the conversation. Panelist Charlie has been on, I believe, every episode except for this one. And then we have panelists Dan, JD, Amy, Mark, and Karen. And I thank them for their contributions, for their encouragement and participation in this podcast. So, as always, when we get to the end of the podcast, we take two steps to the rear and get on out of here. Until the next episode of Diverse Talking Heads Podcast, exit stage left.